Good morning, Year 7, and welcome to your second lesson with me, Mrs. Edwards. So today we're going to be thinking about Henry VIII. Last week we looked at Henry VII, his dad. We're going to look at Henry VIII today and think about who was he. We're going to look at the key facts about Henry and start to explain and evaluate how successful you think he was. So before we start, what can you remember from last lesson? So the 5 questions that are in your fact book I've put here, can you have a go without looking in your fact book at answering these questions? So you can just write the answers down in your book or on some paper, pause the video now and have a go. How much have you learnt then? Let's have a look. So what were the names of the 2 houses who were fighting each other? It was York and Lancaster. Who were the 2 men who were fighting for the crown? King Richard III and Henry Tudor. What's the definition of a civil war? It's a war between groups of people within the same country. On what date was the battle fought? It was the 22nd of August 1485. And where was the crown found before being placed on Henry's head? It was a hawthorn bush. So hopefully you got 5 out of 5. If not, keep practicing and revising them so you can remember them. Last week we looked at Henry VII and we looked at what kind of king he became a little bit after the Battle of Bosworth. Obviously he wanted to make sure there was no more wars, no more fighting for the crown. So when he became king, one of the first things he did was unite the Lancaster and the York family by marrying Elizabeth of York. He also made sure that everyone knew that he'd done that by combining the 2 roses to make the Tudor rose. He also banned private armies to make sure he was strong. He made people give him money and taxes so that he could have them. He made deals with other countries, and he also made sure that he had the best weapons so that he was prepared. So he was quite a successful and clever king. So thinking about those qualities, thinking about all the leaders that you've looked at this year, think about when the Normans invaded. What qualities do you think make a good and successful king? And I want you to pause the video and I want you to write down 5 to 10 qualities in your books that you think make a good and successful king. So a few that I've got, I put maybe they should be strong, they should be confident, a good delegator, so they should make sure that they don't try and do everything because that can be quite overwhelming, but give a few things out to different people. A leader, a good king, should probably be honest, so that people know what he's saying and can trust him. Good at communicating, so communicating with those around him, making sure everyone knows what he's doing, what his plan might be. Decisive, okay, making quick decisions, but making decisions really well. I thought maybe a good leader, a good king could have empathy, so that he knows what things are like for other people and uses that as he leads them. And also particularly, maybe not so much today, but back then, a good leader in the army would help you because obviously battles could be quite common and they might be quite helpful. So keep those written down. You can add some of mine if you want, because we're going to come back to looking at these qualities a little bit later on this lesson. Because we're looking at what's making this king, Henry VIII, successful. Now these are 2 pictures, but they are the same person. So over here on this picture, this is a young Henry. When he'd just become king, he was known as the Renaissance Prince. So the Renaissance period is this time of change and rebirth. And then over here, we've got Henry VIII in his later years. Now you can see there's quite a big difference. If I was asking you what does Henry VIII look like, I imagine you might have gone towards this Henry VIII. Okay, because we all remember him as being quite fat and you're probably thinking, oh, he just had lots of wives. But there was lots more to Henry, and we're going to look at Henry over the next 2 lessons. We're going to look at some of his qualities in his younger years and looking at his wives today. But next week we're going to look at him in religion, and that might change your mind as to what you think about Henry as well. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've just put up the Tudor family tree so you are aware. Obviously we start with Henry VII after the Battle of Bosworth. There he is, just there. Okay, he had 4 children. So he had Arthur, who unfortunately died quite young, so couldn't rule, Margaret, Henry VIII and Mary. Okay, so Henry was born on the 28th of June in 1491. He died in 1547, so he led quite a good long life, particularly at that time, because people didn't live as long as they do today. There's lots of different standards in medication and how people, what they ate, their diet and how they lived. He was King of England from 1509 and ruled for 38 years. That's quite a substantial amount of time. So what impact did he have in those 38 years? He was the second Tudor monarch in the Tudor dynasty, succeeding his father, and he went on to have 3 children, Mary Tudor, Elizabeth and Edward. And we're going to look at Edward and Mary over the next couple of weeks as well, and you'll start to look at Elizabeth next year. Okay. So what was young Henry like? You might, I've not put it on this one, but you might want to pause the video in a bit because you might want to make a little copy of this mind map in your own books. He wrote music, he was really keen for sports, he really liked doing lots of different sports, particularly riding his horse. He loved to bet and gamble, and sometimes he'd win, but sometimes he could lose thousands of pounds in a day, which was never good. He loved jousting, he dealt savagely with people who tried to take his power. He loved to dress in expensive clothes, so he liked to spend lots of money. He was a keen poet. He was very religious and he followed the Roman Catholic Church. You may know that that wasn't always true, and we're going to look at the religious changes next lesson next week. He really enjoyed hunting. He spoke 4 languages, which is obviously very useful if you're communicating with other countries and keeping the peace. He loved entertaining. He started the English Navy, which is really important because that helps keep England safe, because England is an island. In 1536 we've got the Act of Union, which meant that Wales was annexed to England, so he kind of made the first steps to Wales becoming part of Great Britain. He had 55 palaces. Now some might say that is slightly excessive. And in 1521 the Pope gave Henry the title Fidei Defensor, which means defender of the faith, because he stood up against Martin Luther, who was talking about how the church was corrupt, and we're going to look a little bit at him next week. And because he was defending the faith and he was saying, actually no, Catholicism is good, it's not corrupt, the Pope gave him this very honourable title of being Defender of the Faith, and Henry was very proud of it. And actually, if you look at a coin, like a pound coin at home, you might be able to see the words, the letters FD on the pound coin, and also the Tudor rose. So have a look and see if you can. I'll try and put it up on the Instagram this week to show you as well, but it will be really cool, and that's all down from Henry. So what I'd like to do first of all is pause the video, and you might want to go back and rewind, and I want you to make a little mini profile of Henry VIII in your book. So just 1 page is fine, don't do it any more than 2 pages, but you might want to think about copying out maybe the diagram that I showed you before, and think about the following heading, so you could categorise the things that were on the previous slide into what made him athletic, what made him a good Catholic, what big spender he was. So I want to know, like, when he lived, when he ruled, who his children were. So use the information so far and create a little mini profile of Henry VIII in your book, and pause the video. Excellent. So hopefully you got on okay with that. Just to help us a little bit more, I found a source, and I thought we could have a look at what this tells us about Henry VIII. And it's from a poem that was written by Thomas More in 1509. So it was when he was coronated, so when he became king. And Thomas More wrote this at a time when he was one of Henry's most trusted advisors. So obviously that could make the source very inclined to like Henry. But in 1532 he was convicted of treason and beheaded on Henry's orders. But because this was wrote in 1509, you might find that it has a little bit of a positive aspect rather than a negative. But would it be different if he'd written this poem in just before 32, obviously before he was beheaded? So it says, the king stands out the tallest, and his strength fits his majestic body. There is fiery power in his eyes, beauty in his face. He has immediately arrested and imprisoned anyone who harmed the country. So what 3 words do you think you could use that summarise More's opinion of Henry? I mean, I might go with strong, because it talks about the strength that fits his majestic body. I might talk about powerful, talks about, you know, he's got power in his eyes. So maybe this is giving, you know, it's talking about him being powerful. He immediately arrested and imprisoned anyone who harmed the country. So he's not taking any prisoners, is he? He's not really putting up with any nonsense. So have a go, pick 3 words yourself that summarise this opinion, but also have a go at question 2. So explain how this source is useful to a historian studying Henry VIII at the time of his coronation. What does it tell us about what people think about Henry at this time? What kind of character is he putting across about Henry? So have a go at answering those 2 questions and pause the video. But Henry wasn't always like this. Henry, as we all do, got older, he aged. He reigned, as we know, for 38 years, and in that time about 72,000 people were executed, which it's not true, but if we averaged it, that's about 1,900 a year, or 5 every day. So that's quite a lot. And by the time he was 52, he'd become quite cruel, he was bad-tempered, he was paranoid. He was convinced that people were trying to assassinate him. He'd put on lots of weight, he'd had an accident and then struggled to then carry on with the exercise that he'd used to do as a young prince, well, young king, and so they needed a machine to get him on and off his horse. He often complained about headaches and stomach aches. His legs were covered in ulcers, which actually later became really, really infected and turned into gangrene. So we can see he's not the same king throughout the whole of his reign, he does change. And it's important to bear that in mind. And he also, as we know, had lots of wives. He had 6 in total. So what I'd like to do is have a look at finding this clip on YouTube. It's called Henry VIII. And if you just put Henry VIII history teachers into your search bar on YouTube, it will come up with this one. It's not me. I'm not one of these history teachers, though wish I was. And have a listen to this song and write down who were Henry's wives and what happened to each of them all. And think about, what impression does this give you of Henry? What does this make you think about Henry? Do you think he's being good, he's successful, or does it make you question him a little bit more? Have a little think as you watch him. Hopefully you enjoyed the song. So I'm going to go through just briefly these wives again, just to make it really clear. So we've got wife number 1, which was Katherine of Aragon, and she was a Catholic, just like Henry was at the beginning of his reign. She was also a Spanish princess who had married Henry's brother Arthur, but obviously Arthur had died, so Henry decided to marry her instead. She was very clever, she was very popular, but all of her sons that she birthed died, except for her daughter, which was Mary, or Mary the First, as you will know her. But Henry thought she was quite old, she was boring, so he decided that he was going to divorce her. Then he had Anne Boleyn, who he married in 1533 until 1536, when she was beheaded. She was Protestant, so this was just after Henry had turned Britain into a Protestant country, which you're going to learn about tomorrow. Next week, sorry. She was very young, she was very fashionable. She had a daughter, Elizabeth, or Elizabeth I, and Henry obviously was not very happy. He wanted a male. Why did he want a male? Because he wanted to have a strong heir to the throne. His father had worked really hard to make sure that the Tudors could become the next kings and queens of Britain, and so Henry wanted to make sure that he had a strong heir, a strong boy, so that he could take over and there'd be no more fighting for the throne like there was in the Wars of the Roses. He also accused Anne of being unfaithful with several of the men. Didn't have any proof, but you know, what he said went, so he beheaded her in 1536. Then we've got Jane Seymour, who was Protestant. She was calm, gentle, caring. She had a son, so he was obviously overjoyed, Edward. However, Jane died a few days after the birth, and a lot of people talk about how sad Henry was, because I think this was the woman that he did actually love, and when Henry died, he was buried with Jane in the St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Then we've got wife number 4, Anne of Cleves. She was Protestant. She was in an area in Germany. She was quite serious, quite unfashionable. Henry saw a picture of her and thought she looked okay, but then when he actually saw her in person, described her as a horse, so he quickly divorced her. Then we've got Catherine Howard. She was Catholic. She was quite young. She was quite lively. She flirted with lots of people, and Henry did not like this and accused her of cheating, so she was also beheaded like dear Anne. And then finally, we've got Katherine Parr, who was very sensible, very intelligent and kind. She was a bit worried when she was picked to be the next queen for Henry. But she was also very well educated, fluent in several languages, just like Henry was. She'd been married twice before she married Henry himself. She was very good at looking after Henry's children. She looked after Henry because by this point he was really quite old and he was struggling with his weight and with his health and all of his ulcers in his legs. And Henry died in 1547, but Catherine outlived him and survived. So what I'd like to do is, using all this information, you can go back and re-look at the information on the clip. Do you think Henry was a successful king? So I'd like you to write a little newspaper article in your book on Henry VIII's life, and at the end of your article I want you to summarise whether you think he was successful or unsuccessful. Think about what he was like as a young king, think about what he was like as an older king, the source that I used previously. What do you think? He had children, so does that make him successful because he had heirs? Have a think and have a go at writing an article, and think about the qualities that we used at the very beginning that we think make a good king or a successful king and a good leader. Did Henry show these, or did he make good choices compared to his dad? You can also use BBC Bite Size. If you search BBC Bite Size Henry VIII, there's some information on there and some other videos that you could watch which will also help you with this newspaper article. And finally, can you have a go at answering these 5 questions? See how you get on. They're the questions from your fact book. Can you do them without using your fact book? How did you do? So have a look at the 5 questions, give yourself a mark out of 5 and see how you get on. And that's the end of this week's lesson. Sorry it's gone over a little bit over 15 minutes. Hope you're all okay. Let me know if you have any problems or any questions and I will sort them out for you. Next week we're going to have a look at Henry and the church and look at all the changes that he began to make. Take care, Year 7. Bye bye.